I think it's also important for teachers and educators because they tend to underestimate the capacities of the baby brain. It's not just plasticity, it's not just learning, it's a combination of innate abilities and learning. There is no such thing as nature and nurture, there is always both.
Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast that explores how recent discoveries in neuroscience are unraveling the mystery of how our brain makes us human. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 167. I've been hosting Brain Science since 2006 because I passionately believe that understanding the basics of how our brains really work not only enriches our lives, but prepares us to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. Today's guest, Stanislas Dehaene, shares my passion. Before we jump into today's interview, I want to remind you that you can find additional episodes of Brain Science along with episode show notes and transcripts on my website at brainsciencepodcast.com. You can send me feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. And you can post to the Brain Science Podcast fan page on Facebook. We also have a group on Goodreads, which you can get to with the shortcut brainscienceforum.com. Today's guest, neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene, is the author of several best-selling books, including The Number Sense, Reading in the Brain, and Consciousness in the Brain, which I discussed in detail in episode 160. Today, we're going to be talking about his new book, How We Learn, Why Brains Learn Better Than Any Machine for Now. I'll be back after the interview to review the key ideas and to share a few brief announcements. Stanislas, I'm really excited that I'm finally having you as a guest on Brain Science. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
It's a pleasure.
So before we talk about your new book, How We Learn, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. I am a brain scientist at the moment. I started in mathematics initially. My journey is a little bit bizarre one. I started to be essentially very fascinated about computers at the beginning of the personal computer. And I was very interested in whether you could make computers that would be intelligent as we are. I realized that, in fact, there was a science of that. There was a way to study cognition. It's called cognitive science. And when I entered the field, I was very lucky that my start coincided with the onset of brain imaging. It started to be possible to look inside the brain of human beings and to try to use these images of the brain to understand how we compute and how we differ, in fact, from a computer. So I became a cognitive scientist, although my training was in mathematics, and I made use of every possible technique. I started, in fact, interacting a lot with brain lesion patients, because at that time that was about the only information we had about the brain. But then we did a lot more of brain imaging, and now I'm the director of a big center just south of Paris. It's called Neurospin. This is France's most advanced brain imaging center. We have 6 MRIs and many other tools to look at the brain.
So, as I mentioned to you before we started, I featured your last book during my series about consciousness. And one of the things you mentioned in that book was that for a long time, consciousness was considered to be outside the realm of neuroscience. Were you always sort of interested in consciousness, but felt like you couldn't study it? I mean, could you talk about that piece of the journey a little bit?
Indeed, I was trained with the idea that consciousness was beyond the realm of what you could study scientifically. It took me quite a while to think about it more and to realize this was false. But there really was a time in our science where consciousness was taboo. This was a word that you wouldn't use. And this is a field that you wouldn't study unless you were retired.
Or you were Francis Crick, so you could get away with it.
Well, Francis Crick actually helped a lot. He and Christoph Koch were some of the people. There are others, like Larry Weisskranz, for instance, who, by studying patients, showed us that there was a way. I'm a student of Mike Posner in the US, in Oregon, who was also one of the people who said, consciousness is tightly related to attention and we can study both. So eventually I realized that, in fact, there are many, many paradigms to study consciousness. We can manipulate consciousness in the lab. There are many ways we can study visually illusions where there's a dissociation between the objective stimulus and the subjective content that the person is reporting. We can study patience, we can study sleep, we can study vigilance and its loss in coma and vegetative state. At the moment, we do a lot of applied research on this as well. So we found some signatures of consciousness that can be helpful to decide whether a patient in the hospital is or is not conscious. So this has become a huge field in about 20 years. I published my first serious paper on consciousness in 1998. In fact, there were two different papers, one showing that experimentally you could have subliminal and supraliminal stimuli below the threshold of consciousness and above the threshold of consciousness. So we found that this was a lovely way to contrast at the brain level, the brain activation evoked by a non-conscious and by a conscious stimulus, and to study the difference. And I also proposed the theory of consciousness, the global neuronal workspace theory, Jean-Pierre Changeux, which still is, 20 years later, one of the dominant theories of conscious processing.
And that was based on Bernard Baar's original global workspace theory, or?
It's a very important book, I think, Bernard Baar's, but it was solely a psychological theory of consciousness. The little neuroscience that there was, I think, was not what we think today. So my main contribution was to show that this theory could be extended into the neuroscience part and to have a much richer picture of what was happening in the cortex when we become conscious. The concept of ignition is one of the things that we brought to the field.
Another thing that my impression, and I don't read all the literature in your field, obviously, so that's why I'm asking you this. I get the feeling that a lot of the work you did was a big part in our current understanding that so much of what our brain does is not conscious.
Yes, I think this is a key finding from a lot of experiments. In fact, most of the computation in the brain is unconscious, whether it is, face recognition, word recognition, understanding the meaning of a sentence. This is something whose end result is conscious, but the process itself is not. And by making experiments using this subliminal stimuli, we were able to show how far non-conscious stimulus can go in the brain without being detected by the subject. So we could flash pictures. In my case, it was mostly pictures of words, written words, and show that they could go all the way, for instance, to the amygdala, where the meaning is accessed and subjects have a notion of whether a word is emotional or not. For instance, if you flash the word rape, they will strongly activate the amygdala, much more than for a neutral word. And they will do so even when the word is totally impossible to detect. So there's just one example. We have many, many others showing that consciousness is really the tip of the iceberg. It's only a small part of our mental life.
We could go on and on and on and never get around to your new book. So let's focus on your new book today, and maybe you can come back in the future and we go back to consciousness, because it, I think, is, for my listeners, continues to be one of the most popular topics, because for the average person who's not a neuroscientist, but we're conscious and we want to know, well, how'd that happen? Would you give us just a brief overview of your new book, How Will We Learn?
Yes, absolutely. What happened was that I became more and more interested in how we change our brain through education. And I did a lot of work on reading. I have another book on reading in the brain and mathematics. Two great examples where humans, compared to other primates, are able to go much, much farther in understanding the external world and acquiring information in a short period. So I became more and more interested in the learning algorithms of human beings. And that's what the new book is about. It's a review of how we learn and why the human brain is still much better than any machine that we know of, any artificial learning algorithm. I tried to start with a review of what is learning, what it means for a brain to learn, and then how the human brain is especially gifted in learning, why it is superior to many other animals and to all other machines that we know of. And then I end with a more practical part where I speak about, the devices that we can use, that we can all use, in fact, to improve our learning, and that should be used in schools. So what I call the 4 pillars of learning.
Right. And that's really important, because one impression I have is a problem in education is the failure to use the real science.
Yes, but it's a failure of all of us. We all learn, but we have never learned to learn. And the point of the book is really that we can learn to learn better. There are tricks. It's very useful to know more about how our brain does the learning. And then we can use this knowledge in very practical terms in order to acquire information better, whether it's at school or in the office.
And that's the reason why I do this show about neuroscience, because I really believe that knowing things about how our brain works is something that we can use in practical everyday life. So let's start out by defining what you mean by the word learning.
Well, so learning, in my opinion, should be defined as the construction of a mental model. So it's not a trivial thing to think that in our brain we host an enormous variety of models of the external world. We can close our eyes, for instance, and think about the spelling of words, or think about the visit of our apartment and how things are laid over there in our apartment. We have in our brain internal models that we have captured through experience, and they are so rich that they allow us to generate almost an entire virtual reality. This is what happens in our dreams. We are immobile, there is no input, and yet the brain generates an entire reality. So this is what learning is about. It's about adjusting the parameters of an internal model so it fits better with some aspect of the external world. That's, of course, a very broad definition, and we have to think that there are probably thousands of mental models, including some that are extremely abstract, like in mathematics. We are learning about equations and how they are organized, but also some very concrete ones, like I learn the parameters of my body and how much force and aim I must put in order to reach a particular object, for instance.
So that definition that you just gave me sounds like it would be the definition of, well, for sure, the definition of human learning. Yet you point out in the book that learning is universal, and the basic types, like habituation, happen even in very primitive animals. Now, they don't actually have models as far as we can tell. The most primitive learning that some animals do wouldn't quite reach up to the level that you just described.
Oh, no, I disagree. I think even in the case of habituation, it's very simple, but there is a variable inside the animal that corresponds to the amount of concentration of some substance. And so if the substance has been high concentration for a long time, then there's an internal variable that has habituated inside the animal, then that reflects the presence of this substance in the external world. So I think even in this case, even though, it's a minimal model with very few parameters, but somehow the animal is carrying with him, and it can be even a very simple animal like a nematode, a worm. The animal is carrying some knowledge of the external world. You might think that it would be better for evolution to just wire up a brain, but first of all, it's not always possible, because in our brain there are 86 billion neurons, so it would be impossible to code in the genome every single connection of all of these neurons. But also it's not desirable, because we are born in different environments, and we simply cannot anticipate on the specifics of the environment that we'll be born in. So in the human brain, this process has been reached in an incredible level. We are able to acquire information about an extraordinary variety of environment. I claim that we should be called Homo docens, the species that teaches and that learns, that teaches itself, because I think this is the definition of our niche. Other animals have a particular ecological niche, but our niche is the ability to learn.
So in your book, How We Learn, you focus a lot on how babies learn. Why is that so important?
Because it's a characteristic of our species that we are young for a long time, that we have a very extended period of plasticity. It lasts for at least 20 years. And in fact, we remain plastic in some areas for much, much longer, essentially in all areas with differing degrees of plasticity. So it all starts in childhood. And I think it's also important for teachers and educators, because they tend to underestimate the capacities of the baby brain. It's not just plasticity, it's not just learning, it's a combination of innate abilities and learning. There is no such thing as nature and nurture. There is always both. It's 100% of both.
I'm going to break in here to remind you that Brain Science relies on the support of listeners like you. There are 3 ways to support my work: the premium subscription, Patreon, and direct donations. Premium is a great choice for newer listeners because it gives you access to the entire library of brain science going all the way back to 2006. It also gives you transcripts for every episode and occasional bonus content. The best way to get your premium content is via the free Brain Science mobile app, but it can also be downloaded or streamed via your web browser. Patreon is popular with longtime listeners because it allows you to choose a monthly pledge that meets your budget. If you give at least $3 per month, you get new episode transcripts. And if you give $10 or more, you get transcripts and ad-free versions of each new episode, as well as occasional bonus content. You can learn more about this at patreon.com/Doc Artemis. Finally, you can make a one-time donation via PayPal or Venmo, where my username is Doc Artemis. To learn more and pick the option that's best for you, go to brainsciencepodcast.com/donations.
What cognitive science has discovered is that learning is made possible because there are innate domains of knowledge, core knowledge, that we capitalize on in order to go beyond in learning. So in the book, for instance, I described these remarkable experiments, not just about number. This was also a topic of a previous book of mine, The Number Sense, but also about probabilities in babies. And babies have a sense of probability, if you can believe it. They know how to anticipate events that have a certain probability of occurring. If they see 3 balls that are blue and another one which is yellow, and they are shaken in an urn, and then one of them comes out, they think it's much more likely to be the blue one. And they are surprised if they see the yellow one come out, because this was less likely. Experiments show that the amount of looking, the looking time, is directly related to the probability of the event or the improbability. The less likely it is, the longer they look. And what experiments have shown is that the longer they look, the more they learn. It's really part of the learning algorithm. It's a device for orienting towards errors, towards things that you don't yet know and that you have to learn. So this is all starting in the baby, even a few days of age.
And this relates to the idea of the brain as a Bayesian statistician, right? It may be going on in the baby. Do you talk a little bit about that idea, what it means to think of the brain as Bayesian?
Yes, I think it's a very important recent idea, and one that perhaps has not yet made it into actual devices like neural networks and so on, but it's super important. Essentially, Bayesian algorithms provide a sort of optimal way to learn. If you know enough about a domain, you cannot do better than by using these Bayesian statistical algorithms. They essentially say exactly how you should combine your prior knowledge of a field and new evidence that you are getting from the environment. And there is quite a lot of evidence that that's what babies do. In a sense, they act as scientists, as statisticians. They probe the external world through experiments. They look at the result and they interpret what they've seen in the external world in a statistical manner as probabilistic evidence in favor of this or that model. So I follow Alison Gopnik in thinking that the baby is a scientist in the crib, a little scientist who really reasons very rationally about the external world. Essentially, Bayesian statistics, a big word to say that the baby is acting as a rational being, trying to draw optimal inferences from the external world.
So then what goes wrong? I mean, this is a surprising result because the average adult is a terrible statistician. I mean, at least they think they're going to be in a plane wreck when the odds of that are really low.
Well, it's not always true. So this is a matter of debate, and there are many experiments, of course, on this topic. We are not very good when probabilities are conveyed by decimal numbers. So if I tell you there's a 0.0001 probability, you don't understand that very well. But if I tell you about integers, I'll tell you out of 10,000 cases, there was only one where it came out this way, you're much better. And in fact, there is a growing field of Bayesian statistics applied to the adult brain, showing that really that's what our brains do. Of course, it's an approximation. It's not a perfect calculation, but our brains are actually pretty good at estimating the probabilities of events. And our brain is a predictor. The brain constantly tries to anticipate on what's going to happen, generates a prediction, which is probabilistic, and compares then what it gets with that prediction. That's a very important set of theories called predictive coding that I think capture a lot about what the baby is doing already from the start. Innate categories provide some predictions. There's, of course, still a lot to learn on top of this innate core knowledge. And so we learn by detecting the error between what we predicted and what we got.
Okay, so that seems like a really natural way to move on to the question of how machines or computers learn is obviously constantly changing, but what are the key differences for how computers learn and how people learn at the current time?
Right. It's a wonderful topic. Of course, I don't want to diminish the wonderful performance that has been achieved and is still being achieved daily. There are 2 new papers in Nature yesterday from the DeepMind lab showing wonderful progress in AI. So I am impressed by this progress, but I think there are still ways in which the human brain is much better. First of all, we require much fewer data. If you think of a baby acquiring language, the baby is actually getting very little data about the target language. And yet it's able to converge, in fact, better than any machine we know so far, on the regularities, the grammar, the rule, and the lexicon of the language. We can prove that it is using very few words, sometimes just a single instance of a single word. It's using all of the appropriate information about the context, and in particular the social context, in a way that machines cannot do so far. So it's, in a certain sense, reading the mind of the speaker. This social component is another aspect which is completely missing from machines. We don't just learn, we educate ourselves. So we have a theory of mind that tells us that the teacher in front of us is actually trying to help us by giving us examples that are appropriate for us to learn. By using this sort of information, we can go much further and much faster. Again, experiments show that babies do that. They attend precisely to the attention of the adult in front of them, and they use that in order to learn. And I want to mention a third thing in which the brain is superior to other machines. This is in the ability to abstract the information in a symbolic form. If you look at neural networks, artificial neural networks these days, they learn a lot, but they have no idea what they have learned. They are totally unable to formulate it as a symbolic formula, like scientific expression. And that means that they're also totally unable to transmit it to another machine. But we do that routinely. We synthesize the information in a conscious form in a way that we can speak about. And this is remarkable. You know, we are perhaps not as good as learning Go. The machines are better than us these days. But when we learn Go, we can speak about it. We can say, you know, you shouldn't play beyond the 4th row until some moment in the game. And this helps us to learn. We are a species that was able to bootstrap itself because we share the information. This ability to share the information through language, to formulate it explicitly, sometimes in the form of equations, is absolutely central, and it's not imitated by machines at the moment.
So I got the impression from the book that one of the key things that's going on is, at this current point in time, artificial intelligence is really only, to a certain extent, mimicking what the unconscious parts of our brain does, but doesn't really have any ability to do what our consciousness does yet.
Well, I think for the most part, that's exactly what I tried to say. Yeah. I think this is certainly true of the so-called convolutional neural networks, CNNs, which is a subset of artificial neural networks that mimic the way our visual system reacts and recognizes a face, for instance, or an object. These networks mimic quite well what happens in our brains in about 200, 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second. That's the unconscious pathway. But then beyond that, they are not very good. If, for instance, an object is occluded behind another and you have to reconstruct what's behind, they're not very good. This requires a sort of top-down conscious attention that they're not super good at mimicking. There is always constant progress. So I don't want, again, to, poo-poo what has been done in AI. It's fantastic. And I think also all the examples that I give in my book, they are known by researchers in AI, and they are the focus of a lot of work. So, for instance, attention is increasingly being put in artificial neural networks with fantastic success. But this is only a recent event. It's only like the past 6 or 7 years.
What about the role of self-organization in the brain? Is that something else that would set our brains apart from artificial networks?
To some extent, can be simulated, but it's true that many of our cortical maps somehow self-organize in a way that Alan Turing described. That is to say, they will organize themselves just spontaneously on the basis of some input to separate categories, for instance. And we think that this is a form of learning, so-called unsupervised learning, which is again very, very efficient in the brain. We are getting now into the issue not just of how we learn at the psychological level, but also how we learn at the neural level. And this is, of course, an important chapter in the book. I try to describe what we know about plasticity, about how synapses modify themselves, and how this eventually becomes the substrate of learning. It's an area that is still moving, but we really begin to know a lot, and I think it's useful to know. So, for instance, did you know that when you look at a little baby for just 1 second, probably something like 2 or 3 million synapses have been changing, either disconnecting or reconnecting. The babies, until the age of about 1 or 2, they have many more synapses than we do. There's an overproduction of synapses, and that probably explains why they are so extraordinarily plastic. Then the number of synapses will decrease. We select, we prune the synaptic trees of the neurons until we reach adulthood, where we have a sort of pruned down system that is much more efficient, but less able to learn. And another thing which I found as I was reading about this very intriguing is that we begin to understand why we lose plasticity. First of all, we've lost some synapses, but second, the neurons are also surrounding themselves, the pyramidal neurons, with a sort of matrix of rigid molecules that prevent synapses from being made. It's like the neurons are in a cage. They cannot move anymore. The child's brain is a much more liquid state. It has a lot of water. There's a lot of movable parts that are still growing. At the adult state, it's a much more rigid system that physically cannot move. So when you think of brain plasticity, you have to think it completely literally. They are moving elements in your brain. In particular, on the dendrites of the neurons, there are little spines, minuscule ones, 10,000 per neurons, that move around. They retract, they contract, they multiply, and that's the substrate of learning.
But we can still learn, unless we have Alzheimer's disease, we can still learn throughout our lives.
It depends.
Well, what about, is there something we can do to maximize our plasticity as we get older?
Well, that's a great question. The first thing is to recognize that there are sensitive periods and that these depend very much on the domain. There are some domains where really plasticity is extremely early and then closes down. One case in point is phonological learning. When we acquire the sounds of language, this goes on in the first year of life. The baby has not even started to speak, but he has already converged onto the categories of vowels and consonants. Vowels about 6 months, consonants after about 12 months. At this point, you are no longer hearing the differences between phonemes that are not useful in your language. So Japanese speakers no longer hear the difference between R and L. It can still reverse for a few years, and that's also a subject of research, not fully known. But let's say after the age of 9 or 10, it begins to freeze completely and cannot reverse anymore. The same is true for grammar. There are beautiful experiments. There's one experiment with millions of subjects. It was run off the internet by Steve Pinker and his colleagues in Harvard. And what they found was that there is a slowly decreasing curve for the ability to acquire grammar. And then it collapses dramatically. So if you are trying to learn a second language, you should really learn that before puberty, because after that, it's really much, much more difficult. But as you say, there are other domains, like we can learn new words. So the lexicon is not a big problem. We remain plastic. We don't quite understand why some brain areas remain plastics and others lose it.
So I want to touch on something that you didn't spend a lot of time in your book, but that I think is really interesting, which is your neuronal recycling hypothesis.
It's a very simple idea. We are the only primate species that is able to learn completely new tricks. One of them is reading. The use of our eyes in order to convey information that normally should come through spoken language. Another is mathematics, manipulation of symbols in order to do calculations in very abstract domains. So my claim is that when we acquire these domains, we have to recycle, to reorient, to repurpose circuits that had evolved for another purpose. Maybe a slightly related one. So in the case of reading, we understand a lot about this. We know that some visual circuits of the brain that used to be able to recognize objects and faces reorient in order to recognize the shapes of words and the strings of letters. And they become tuned to the particular letters that we have learned to read. So we have seen this occurring. We did some recent experiments, for instance, where we scanned some children several times as they were acquiring reading. And so we could see their brains change. And this part of the object recognition circuit is being reoriented towards the acquisition of letter shapes. So I think this is a general phenomenon. We have in our brain a number of circuits that are partially pre-wired, but because of plasticity, they can be reoriented to a novel activity. And for the teacher, I think this is important. It means that we never start with a tabula rasa. The brain is never a tabula rasa, a blank slate. We have some initial abilities, and we have to grow something new out of it. Sometimes it helps. Like in the case of reading, we have invariance, so we can recognize a word regardless of its size, because that's what the object recognition is wired up to do, recognize objects wherever they are, however big they are. But sometimes it's also a problem, and we also need to know about that as a teacher. For instance, in the case of reading, the visual system is wired such that you recognize a face, whether it's in the right profile or in the left profile. Well, great, it's fantastically useful. There's a tiger coming from the left. You see it's the same tiger if it's coming from the right. Great. But now you get the letter B, and you think it's exactly the same as the letter D. And your visual system tells you it's the same. I've worked with young children, and I've also worked with illiterate people who have never been to school, and they just cannot see that it's different. They just tell you it's the same. So this is something that we have to overcome. It's something that's given to us by our visual circuitry. But when we recycle this circuitry for reading, we have to overcome it, and it takes time and effort. It's not dyslexia. Many people think that mirror error are dyslexia. It's a completely natural feature of our brain, everybody's brain, but it's something that we have to recycle and overturn in order to acquire reading. So I think the recycling theory helps to understand the relation between our innate circuitry and how we can go beyond that.
This has implications, I guess, if somebody is trying to learn how to read as an adult.
Well, unfortunately, what we are finding is that it's much, much more difficult. So what you have to imagine is the ventral part of the brain. There is a sheet of cortex. It's covered with specialized regions. There is one region in particular that's well studied, which is specializing for faces. But there are other regions that specialize for words. Some others specialize for numbers. The specialization can be amazing. So it's not the same area for letters and for numbers because they play different purposes. And these areas have to be laid down early on, probably before puberty again. Trying to learn as an adult, well, you use whatever you've learned when you were young, but you are not going to be able to completely reorient these patches of cortex. You're going to have to deal with whatever state they are in at the moment. So I think that explains the difficulty. These adults that are illiterate, they have the hardest time in the world just figuring out that a B and a D are different.
So we sometimes, for those of us who have read since we were small children, we may not appreciate the challenge that they're really facing.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. I think it's part of the difficulty for teachers. I speak a lot to teachers these days because I became the head of the Scientific Council for Education in France. And I think part of the difficulty is that when you're an adult, well, you no longer realize how difficult the learning process is. You no longer realize the tricks that are played by your brain and that you've overcome, so you don't see the difficulty anymore. This, in particular, has given rise to the idea of whole word reading or whole language reading, which we know is wrong from the scientific point of view. But it's true that as an adult, you look at a word and unconsciously, all of the letters are processed at once, and you have a feeling of whole word recognition. It's not true. At the brain level, we can show that every single letter is still being processed. But it's even less true of the child. The child has absolutely no access to the whole word. It has to decode the letters almost one by one, left to right. And so we know that this is the wrong intuition on the part of the teacher, and we must fight that. I think there are direct consequences of all we know about learning and the brain for education, and that's what I try to propagate in the Scientific Council.
Since this is a long interview, I'm going to break in here to remind you to listen past the end of the interview for my review of the key ideas and a few brief announcements. I don't want you to miss the details about how you can help take brain science to the next level in 2020. I'm planning to release a second expanded edition of my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, in May 2020, and I want to make sure you get a copy of it as soon as it's released. Please listen to the end to find out more. And I do have quite a few teachers that listen to this show, so I want to devote a pretty good chunk of time now to the 4 pillars of learning that you mentioned at the beginning. So you want to sort of take us through those and maybe highlight how they are important in this idea for teachers?
Yes, although, of course, it's a lot of information. So, yeah.
Well, just hit the high points.
Of course. Well, there are 4 pillars. I call them attention, active engagement, error feedback, and consolidation, including sleep. And I call them pillars because each of them is really important in multiplying the effect of learning, in enhancing the effect of learning. So if we learn to manipulate them well, we can really enhance our learning in the pupils, but also in ourselves. So attention, the first one. The brain is a filter. At the highest level of processing in the brain, you only can process a small amount of information, perhaps one information at a time at the highest level, at the conscious level. So it means that there is a gigantic filter that takes the million of bits of information that reaches our retina and decides that only a small part is important. If attention is misdirected, you're not learning. There's very little learning in the absence of attention. So we need to learn to attend. We need to focus. We need to avoid distraction. On the other hand, it's a very helpful thing. If you attend, you dramatically amplify information. Information which is really on the corner of your eye, somewhere on the retina, can become dramatically amplified and access this global workspace where it becomes the focus of conscious attention. So my claim is that the teacher's most important talent is to direct children's attention to the appropriate level. They must decide what is important and what is not. And this translates into extremely practical information. For instance, there is experimental research, which I describe in the book, that says that you should not excessively decorate your classroom. That the classroom which is too decorated distracts children because there's lots of things that you could attend, and you get distracted. The same, of course, applies to the phone or to tablet computer. You want focus, not distraction. So that's the first pillar. It's a big one. There really is very little learning in the absence of attention. So when a child tells you, for instance, I don't see, this is something that happens in mathematics. Do you see it? No, I don't see it. Could be a very abstract concept. What does it mean? Well, it's very literal. The children are not able to attend to the appropriate concept, and therefore they are simply blind. We can be completely blind in the absence of attention. I think you all know about the invisible gorilla experiment. You can have a gorilla in front of you and not see it because you're not attending. So I think it's exactly the same in schools. Some children are completely honest when they say, I don't see, even though it's in front of their eyes, because they haven't learned how to focus their attention at the proper level, and we need to guide them.
So active engagement.
So active engagement, that's pillar number 2. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that the child must be pedaling or doing physical exercise. This has been one of the misinterpretations. What I mean is that the child's brain must be actively engaged, acting as a scientist. We started with this, formulating hypotheses, performing experiments, mental experiments, projecting actively on the external world hypothesis and selecting among them, as opposed to being passive. So we know that there is very little learning in a passive organism. If you just bombard a child with information passively, not much is learned. For instance, there are beautiful experiments. Actually, you put an object in front of the child, and at the same time, there's a loudspeaker in the room that gives the name of the object. Zero learning. Even though there is a perfect correlation between the name and the object, there's essentially no learning whatsoever. There is learning when the child is engaged, typically by another person with whom he shares attention, and when there is curiosity. So I speak a lot about curiosity in the book. I think it's one of the major systems that we need to study at the brain level. We begin to know a little bit about it. The human brain in particular has a motivation system, which is not just driven by food or by sex. It's the dopamine system, of course, which is universal in mammals at least. But in our case, it's driven by the urge to learn. We have a system that will give us a little discharge of dopamine and reward when we can explore a new domain, when we can ask a new question and get the answer. So curiosity is a fundamental property of the learning algorithm. We need to trigger it and to foster it. We need to try to avoid to kill it. And of course, unfortunately, school can kill curiosity if it gives the impression that the teachers knows everything and all I have to do is sit there. So this is the idea of the child as a curious, playful individual who actively engages in the learning. So again, it translates into very direct applications. There is beautiful research in the classroom, all sorts of research actually showing that you shouldn't do magistral lecture, but it's much better to have the child actively interacting with the teacher, for instance, being able to ask questions. There are some teachers that say you should spend half of the lesson with a question from the learner. There are many ways, of course, to actively engage the child, but that's the general idea.
I've read a lot about this particular aspect because I become concerned when I'm creating a podcast and somebody's just going to be listening to it, which could theoretically be a passive thing. But it sounds like the difference or key question is the listener curious? Because if I'm listening to something I'm not interested in, I'm not even going to hear it. But if I'm really interested, my curiosity is what's going to drive my listening.
So I think you want a curious listener to your podcast. I think you also want a speaker in your podcast who somehow manages to feed that curiosity by creating mental images, by giving examples, for instance. This is one thing that we do. You try to sparkle something in the listener's mind. And I think there are big differences between teachers in this ability to create an interesting mental image in the child to foster curiosity. Not only you want an active child who is engaged in generating hypotheses, but you want the third pillar, error feedback, in order to select the hypothesis. In order to learn properly, we want to generate a hypothesis and immediately know whether it's true or false, whether it works or not, whether it fits the world or not. So the brain makes a prediction and then must receive an error signal that tells it whether this prediction is correct or not. What we found at the brain level is that a lot of the messages that are exchanged between brain areas are error signals. I anticipated something about music, and then suddenly I hear a sour note. It's not in the proper place, and I have to correct my mental model of the melody. I didn't have the proper model of the melody. So this is something also that the teachers must know. Send precise, informative error feedback signals. It has nothing to do with punishment. It has nothing to do with grades, which are, summary statements that are not informative enough. It is a precise feedback about what went right and what went wrong and how you can correct.
I see this in medicine where we've started the things we use for our continuing medical education now are designed to give us immediate feedback of whether our answer was right or wrong. So we actually learn instead of just doing some activity that's intended to fill some box.
Yes. So there is, in fact, beautiful experimental research again on this. So suppose you have 2 hours to learn something. Should you just spend the 2 hours revising in the textbook, studying the textbook? Maybe you put some color on it, or should you have some periods where you study and some periods where you test yourself? And it's not completely trivial because when you test yourself, of course, you don't study. So you lose time in a certain sense. So when the experiment was done, the experimenters asked teachers what were their predictions. And they all say, well, you should study. The more you study, the better you are. Well, it's not true. What is true is that if you test yourself, you are better. Why? Because when you test yourself, you get this error feedback. You know that there are some items that were right and you don't need to revise them again. But you know also that there are some where you were wrong. It's important to test yourself not immediately, but after a little period. Because when you just studied, the information is still in your working memory or in your recent memory. So you have the impression of knowing. But this is not the right memory system. It's not the one that you are going to need in the long run, the next day. So if you wait just 5 minutes or 10 minutes and you test yourself, you realize that in fact you don't know. And then you can correct yourself. You get the error feedback that allows you to correct your mental model. I try to explain to teachers that this has nothing to do with bad grades, that there's something to avoid, which is punishment. It's a very negative effect on learning. We all freeze and the learning algorithm stops if we are under stress or under negative feedback. So you want to have just a non-punitive assessment of what was right and what was wrong.
What if you punished a baby that was learning how to walk every time it fell. That would not end well.
Yes. And then so many teachers know that, of course. And I think my favorite example is music learning. Music teachers usually know it's completely normal the first time you try to play an instrument not to be correct, right? But they also know that with appropriate effort and day after day training, you will get there. And I think this is this notion of patience, resilience, and effort are things that we need to bring to all of the different forms of learning that we experience, including in the classroom. So this is leading actually to our fourth pillar, which is consolidation. It's not enough to just learn. You need to consolidate. You need to automatize. Learning must be transferred from the conscious compartment, the conscious global workspace, to a non-conscious compartment. This is absolutely essential because you need to free the resources of the cortex, in particular the prefrontal cortex, for other learning. So when you begin to learn something, your mental resources are absolutely stretched. Maybe I can give an example. I remember very well when I started to learn to drive a car, and maybe you remember as well. It's a catastrophe, my God. And of course, in Europe, we have to learn to drive with a stick shift. So there is also the hands are doing a lot of things as well as the feet, and you have to watch in the mirror, and the guy next to you is speaking to you, and it's horrible. Your frontal cortex is completely overloaded. Just wait few hours, few lessons, 20 lessons perhaps, and you come back and it's completely different. The learning of how to move the feet and the hands become automatized, and you feel much more at ease. You've learned essentially to automatize a lot of activities. And then you can think about something else, like listening to the radio perhaps. So it's just an example to show you how important it is to automatize. What is fantastic is that we begin to know how it works. And one important aspect of how it works is sleep. Sleep is a key moment of learning. This is absolutely non-trivial. I think we all think that when we sleep, we just rest, but that's not true. Our brain doesn't rest. Our brain learns very actively, and we begin to see it in brain imaging also at the neuronal level. So when we sleep, what has been discovered? Well, first of all, the psychologist made a discovery. The psychologist discovered that you could learn something ad nauseam during the day, maybe for 3 or 4 hours. Maybe it's a video game, for instance. And there's a point where you don't get better. You reach an asymptote and you just stay there. You go to sleep, and the next morning you haven't practiced anything, but the next morning you are better. That's just an experimental finding. So it looks like the period of sleep somehow made you better. And then the neuroscientist made a discovery. The neuroscientist found that, in fact, the brain has been rehearsing during the night. This was found in the rat, first of all. They found that the neurons that were firing during the day actually fired again during the night in precisely the same sequence and the same neurons that had been activating during the day in a particular period of learning. So, for instance, the rat maybe was exploring a maze. There was a very precise pattern of activity of the place cells that, each neuron has a certain place. And so when you move in a maze, these places get activated in a sequence. Well, during the night, the very same neurons were activated in the very same sequence, with one difference was that they were activated much faster and therefore many more times. The brain was replaying the activation perhaps 15 times or 20 times faster. And this is a way to rehearse during the night without even being conscious of it. There have been many, many studies of this, including in humans. We can, for instance, enhance this replay, and then the brain learns better. If you have deeper sleep and more periods of these deep sleeps when there's more replay, then you have better learning. There are now companies that try to enhance this sleep in various ways, and then you get better learning. So I think this is an absolutely essential element for parents and teachers and for all of us, in fact. By sleeping well, we can enhance the learning.
Does it matter what time of day we do the original learning?
It doesn't seem to. It also does not matter when we sleep. So, for instance, there are experiments about naps, and naps are also important, and they have a consolidation effect. It does matter at what age you do it. So, once again, children are advantaged. There is one study where the effects of the same amount of sleep, one night of sleep, is 3 times larger in young children. So you see how important it is. And we all know, of course, that babies and young children must sleep longer. It's much more important for them because they are learning more. In fact, there is evidence for a sort of homeostasis. So when you do a lot of learning during the day, you have to sleep more during the night. It's a wonderfully organized system, but we just need to be more aware of it, because many of us, lose sleep. We get distracted by TV or by series or by the computer. And when we lose sleep, we also lose some ability to learn and to consolidate.
Yeah, I think that's one piece of practical information we can all use.
Oh, yes. And also, I want to say we make discoveries during sleep. It's not just reserved for scientists, So, first of all, this has been proven by experiment. It's true that the brain will make discoveries during sleep. But we all do. In fact, children make discoveries, for instance, about the meaning of words during sleep. They have an experience of a few words during the day, but they generalize. They place the word in a broader context. They understand the multiple meanings of some words during the night. And when they wake up the next day, they have consolidated their learning of the word.
So, Stan, how do you think, you learned all this stuff about how babies learn and how it changes our brain. What kind of impact are these discoveries having on our general understanding of the human brain?
Well, I think it's one of the essential properties of humans, first of all. This is one of the most exciting areas of study, in neuroscience, how we learn. I also think that it has an impact on how we view ourselves, as the period of childhood is one of the most important periods for shaping a human mind. It is a period where you need to enrich the environment, because the amount of enrichment of the environment shapes who we are, basically. And the human brain is special in this respect. It's absorbing much more from others, in particular, from the social environment. I think this means that we have a special responsibility for our children. We need to provide them with the best possible environment during this blessed period where they are learning. I say that because I think we can still improve a lot, First of all, we must provide children with the appropriate language. There is a beautiful experiment that I explained in the book that showed that the amount of child-directed language that is received by a child has a direct impact on the organization of the brain networks for language. And we know that there are huge differences as a function of socioeconomic status when children are preparing to learn to read. And this will have a determinant effect on their ability to learn to read fast and on the rest of their scholarity. So we have a big responsibility here. And it's not just the environment as providing stimuli for learning, but it's also providing the appropriate biological materials, nutrition, vitamins, oxygenation, sleep, the lack of poison, such as alcohol, for instance. There is a whole environment for a healthy brain to learn optimally. I mentioned alcohol because we know that exposure to alcohol in utero has dramatic effects on the ability of the child brain to develop properly, and this will have lifelong effects. In the book, I give other examples. There's a dramatic example of children in Israel who were deprived of a specific vitamin, and years later, even though they were deprived for just a few weeks, years later, they still have impairments in their language areas of the brain, the language system. So there is a very precise system that needs to be well fed, both intellectually and also physically. At the same time, there is a fantastic resilience, and that's also the message of the book. There is this ability to learn means that we can overcome some of the early insults of life. And it also means that learning is much more abstract than we think. We haven't talked about that, but in the book, I speak a lot about patients with lesions. For instance, we've done experiments on people who are blind who become professional mathematicians. So you can be completely blind and yet have completely normal ideas about the abstract concepts of mathematics. It means that we overestimate the sensory aspect of what we do. The brain is projecting very abstract hypotheses and can correct for missing information, even the missing modality of vision. I also studied a little child who was tetraplegic and blind and developed completely normal language and ability to do mental imagery and write stories and so on and so forth. So I think there is both a sense of resilience, but also a sense of responsibility in feeding this little brain with the most appropriate information.
Well, I hope that lots of people will read this book because it's full of really exciting stuff. What else would you like to share before we close?
I think we've talked about so many ideas. I'm not sure if there's anything left. Maybe I would like to conclude perhaps with going back to the idea of artificial intelligence. I don't mean to say that artificial intelligence is a doomed project, not at all. I think that in fact, I see no reason why the human brain could not be copied and some of these algorithms could not be copied in a machine. We are little machines. But what I try to say in the book is that the baby is the most incredible machine so far. It is the best supercomputer in the world, and we must respect that and we must study it in order to have better machines in the end.
Do you have any advice for students that are interested in going into science?
Well, I think there is a lot of advice in the book about how they should go about learning. But perhaps the most important for a scientist, it's a quite peculiar job, you know. I would say the most important is curiosity. You must have the sparkle that makes you curious about anything. Science is a lot of focus about things that look very trifle to other people, you know. You spend 3 or 4 years on a PhD, which is really, my PhD was how you compare a number with another. How do you decide that 4 is smaller than 5? And so most people look at me and they say, well, well, I just know that 4 is smaller than 5. I tell them, well, how do you know? How does it work in the brain? You have to be interested and focused and curious about all sorts of things. I think this is the key quality.
Yeah, one of the things I try, and you have done a great job of sharing this today, is the idea that science isn't a bunch of static facts. Like you talked about how school can ruin curiosity. I think it's incredible, at least the way it's taught in the United States, that anyone becomes a scientist based on the way that science is taught in school, because they make it so boring.
Well, it's not always the case. I think the U.S. education has some qualities, which is to make the child very happy about going to school and feeling surrounded by exciting, information. I may be misestimating, but it seems to me that this is a problem that we face in schools in France. If we look at international comparisons like the PISA studies by the OECD, we find that, in fact, children in France are more likely to say, I think that the teacher does not help me enough. The teacher is not there to help me. It's more there to sanction me. So there are some qualities, I think, to the US education, which is this ability to foster enthusiasm and confidence in children. Of course, there still needs to be a lot of rigorous studying, and maybe that can be improved.
Well, I'm looking forward to sharing this with my listeners, and I would love to have you to come back someday and talk some more about your work with consciousness, because that's a fascinating area. And I read your book, The Reading Brain, and of course, Consciousness in the Brain. I'm hoping to get, is it Andrew Nieder? Is that the right pronunciation?
Andreas Nieder. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, he has a new book out too.
On number.
On number, yeah. So I'm hoping to get him on soon.
Well, that's a very good idea. He's superb, and we've collaborated on some reviews of the number field. His book is a sort of big update on my book from many years ago, The Number Sense, and it's much more specific about how neurons in the brain encode number, which I think is a fascinating discovery.
That's what I'm hoping for, but I would love to have you back on someday.
Certainly.
First, I want to thank Stanislas Dehaene for taking the time to talk with us about his new book, How We Learn, Why Brains Learn Better Than Any Machine for Now. I think How We Learn will be of special interest to students, teachers, and parents, as well as anyone who aspires to be a lifelong learner. It's definitely accessible to readers of all backgrounds. Before I review the key ideas from today's interview, I want to reflect on how this interview affected me personally and how this relates to my aspirations to take brain science to the next level in 2020. As I listened to Dr. Dehaene talk about his passion for bringing his work into the world of education, I realized that I have a similar goal for brain science. Almost every day I get an email from a listener telling me how the podcast has impacted their life, sometimes in surprising ways. For example, a few days ago, I got a message from a listener who told me that brain science is helping him cope with signs of early onset dementia. Emails like this reinforce my conviction that understanding the basics of neuroscience matters to how people live their lives. For years, I have resisted putting the content of brain science into book form because I felt that I could not afford another time-consuming project that was unlikely to generate much income. But last year, I realized that there are too many people who need this information that may never listen to a podcast. Sure, I want to sell books and attract new listeners, but I want to keep an eye on the real goal, helping other people by sharing knowledge that I know will make their lives better. This is where you come in. I'm counting on you to help me reach more people by sharing your own stories about why neuroscience matters to you. I will be talking more about this in the coming months. But for now, I will mention that the expanded second edition of Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty will be coming out in May 2020. I will announce the exact date at least a month in advance, since my publisher says that if we sell 200 copies on the first day, we can hit number 1 in neuroscience. With your help, I think this is a very reachable goal. One small thing that you can do today is join the Brain Science Podcast group on Goodreads by going to brainscienceforum.com. Let's finish up by reviewing a few key ideas from today's interview. The main idea is that babies are not blank slates. They are born with some innate knowledge, such as assumptions about objects and even a number sense that includes the ability to judge simple probabilities. They are also prodigious learners, partly because their brains are incredibly plastic. Dr. Dehaene pointed out that every second, 2 to 3 million synapses change in the baby's brain. There is mounting evidence that the human brain uses something that resembles Bayesian statistics, which means that it uses its prior knowledge to make predictions, and then it adjusts its predictions based on what actually occurs. Dehaene sees babies as little scientists who are constantly experimenting. Think of this the next time you watch a baby repeatedly drop or throw objects on the floor. We also talked a bit about why babies are actually better learners than our current computers. Computers require huge data sets to learn, while babies learn with as little as one exposure. Language is the prototypical example of this. There's also a social aspect to the way babies learn. They know adults are trying to teach them, and they can tell what the adults are paying attention to. Also, as humans, we're able to describe what we have learned and use language both to share and learn more. This is a form of bootstrapping our learning. The bottom line is that computers only emulate the unconscious aspects of human learning. For example, object recognition software emulates the first 250 milliseconds, the unconscious object recognition part, but it struggles with things like reconstructing an object that is occluded behind something else. Another important idea is the neuronal recycling hypothesis. This is the idea that learning new skills involves repurposing brain areas that evolved for something else. Again, reading is the best example because there's lots of evidence that when we learn to read, we repurpose parts of the cortex that are previously dedicated to object recognition. And one of the things that we have is something called invariance, where when we look at something or its mirror image, we see it as the same thing. This is actually a challenge when you learn how to read because, for example, the letter B and the letter D are mirror images of each other and can be hard to tell apart for a beginning reader. It's not dyslexia. It's actually overcoming our default object invariance assumption. It's also one of the things that makes it hard for adults to learn to read. He pointed out that sometimes people that are adults when they learn to read never can see the difference between a B and a D. Understanding how a brain learns to read makes it clear why so-called whole word reading doesn't work for beginning readers. Scientists have shown that the brain actually decodes every letter, but because the process becomes automatic, we have the illusion that we read each word as a whole. But this won't work for the beginning reader because the decoding hasn't become automatic yet. They still need to read every letter. This brings us to the main theme of today's conversation, the importance of using what science is revealing to improve the way we teach both adults and children. That's why Dehaene wants to emphasize what he calls the 4 pillars of learning. These are attention, active engagement, error feedback, and consolidation. I'm not going to go into these in any detail, but I will mention that we talked about how important sleep is for consolidation. And when it comes to error feedback, I was really startled to learn the evidence that you actually learn better when you do frequent self-testing compared to just extensively reviewing. I think that's a piece of information that any of you that are students ought to put into use. This episode is full of information that will be useful to teachers, parents, students, and lifelong learners. I want to encourage you to share it with others and to read How We Learn, Why Brains Learn Better Than Any Machine for Now by Stanislas Dehaene. Don't forget that you can get complete show notes and episode transcripts at my website at brainsciencepodcast.com. While you're there, you can sign up for the free newsletter and get the show notes automatically. You can also go to brainsciencepodcast.com/donations to learn how you can support the show. If you have feedback or ideas you'd like to share, please email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Submit voicemail at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis, or post to the Brain Science Podcast fan page on Facebook. For those of you who prefer to avoid Facebook, there is a Brain Science Podcast group on Goodreads, which I mentioned earlier, and you can get there by going to brainscienceforum.com. This is something that I hope to reinvigorate in the coming months. So I'll be back again in 2 weeks with another episode of Brain Science. In the meantime, I hope that you will check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas and Grain Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Brain Science is copyright 2020 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You can share this audio with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mindfire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.